Thanks everyone for being here. My name is Amanda Udis-Kessler. I am a church musician, hymn writer, sacred music composer, and for today's purposes, I serve as the director of DEI and member education for the United Church of Christ Musicians Association, or UCCMA, or UCMA as we often call ourselves. And we are a little service community that tries to support church musicians within and beyond the United Church of Christ. And one of the ways we do that is through these Saturday sharings. I should note that we have not yet started establishing the Saturday sharings for the fall yet for our 26-27 season, and that is because we are going to get through our conference in Columbus, Ohio this summer and reflect on that and determine the direction we want to take these sharings in future. But that's why you haven't seen anything about them yet. If you have not signed up for the conference, we have extended the early bird registration discount through the end of tomorrow. So please consider signing up for that. You can always go to uccma.org to get to our website, learn more about the conference. We do not have our conference host with us today, and we do not have our president with us today. But Ed and I are here representing. Oh, and Peter, welcome. Peter, lovely to see you. Peter is the UCCMA chaplain and a musician and pastor at in a little church in Maine. So with that, I am now happy to get us underway. We are welcoming Brian Hehn today from the Center for Congregational Song, connected with the Hymn Society in the United States and Canada. And Brian, before I start throwing questions at you, why don't you just tell us all a little bit more about who you are and what you're working on these days?
Sure. Um, who I am. Let's see. I live in Baltimore, Maryland, where my wife was originally from, and we're raising our two children, which is why I was racing to be here because we are at their dance recital, which got scheduled after this had already been scheduled. And so I'm grateful for the time change and bumping it back an hour to allow me to see my daughter in her ridiculously adorable uh, 5-year-old dance routine. So well worth it. Um, and let's see, I grew up Presbyterian with organ and choir and handbells. And then I went to an undergraduate university where I found myself in a cooperative Baptist congregation singing those old Baptist gospel hymns. And I was doing music education because I love teaching and I love music. And I was an intern at that little cooperative Baptist church for all 4 years that I was in school. And then I realized I didn't want to be a public school teacher. I wanted to be a church musician. And so I went and studied at a Methodist seminary called Perkins School of Theology with Dr. C. Michael Hahn. And meanwhile, I had the opportunity to go to places like the Iona community where I served for 9 weeks as a volunteer. And that really opened my eyes to how the global church could sing together and what the global church was singing. And since then, I've served Roman Catholics and Presbyterians and Methodists, and I currently serve at a Lutheran, you'll see a Lutheran church, all the while serving for the Hymn Society. And so my journey has been very ecumenical. I'm constantly interacting with all sorts of different types of Christians. And so far, the capstone of those experiences has been I most recently was a part of a global education cohort through the World Council of Churches that met for 2 weeks in Egypt, being hosted by the Coptic Church there, the Coptic Orthodox Church, and got to spend 2 weeks learning very in depth with Christians from all around the world, from all sorts of different backgrounds and traditions. And so I am just glad to be here with you, United Church of Christ folks. And I'm looking forward to talking about congregational song, which is the thing that I've spent most of my career kind of doing a deep dive in and being passionate about. So that's a little bit about me.
That's wonderful. Thanks. And before I get started with the pre-prepared questions, we are going to try to go through those such that there is a few minutes at the end for other folks who are with us on the call to ask you their questions or make their comments or have whatever conversation we have. So we try to leave, give or take, 10 or 15 minutes toward the end for that. But we have a relatively small number of formal questions today. All of them, however, I think are quite rich. And so you should feel free to take as much time as you like in answering them. And we'll start with, I think, the kind of obvious starter. Why is congregational singing so important in worship? What roles does it play in enriching a worship service?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing I want to say about this question, why is congregational singing so important in worship, is that for those of us who are already passionate about it or who work as church musicians or pastors or any other leaders of Christian worship, this song or this song, this question might feel, yeah, like you said, kind of obvious or like, oh, why do we have to talk about that? But I have just been constantly surprised at how often, when serving at the local level, I've had to have conversations with people about this question, and they've never thought about it, or they think the answer is it's not so important. And I've had to have that conversation of no, no, this is really important. And so I'm glad that we're starting here, even though it feels like a basic question, especially for a group like this. I think it's so important, and there's lots of great resources that can help us have those conversations and help kind of deepen and widen our understanding of why it's so important. And the first is, of course, the Bible, right? I mean, there is a biblical mandate to sing together. The Psalms are the obvious place to start. Sing a new song to the Lord. And it's, peppered throughout the Psalms. Of course, the Psalms themselves are the songbook of the church, and or at least of the ancient church and the Jewish people. And so, we could always start there. I'm not going to dwell on that. If you want to know more about the Psalms, this year the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship has been doing a deep dive into psalm singing and why the psalms are important and how to use them in some creative ways. And that's something they've really kind of cut their teeth on since the beginning of their organization. And this year, they're really focusing on that. And so check out all the resources on their website and conferences and all that kind of stuff. But other biblical examples are things like, after the Red Sea, when the Red Sea parted and the Jewish people, found themselves on the other side, and the Egyptian army was swept away. The first thing that happened was Miriam led the people in song and dance. And so we have this wonderful example of celebrating God's victories and God's salvation of the world through song and dance. So singing together is all the way back then. Of course, then as Christians, we think about how can we be more Christ-like? And we don't know a lot about Jesus. I mean, the biblical witness only has a little bit about the birth and then about 3 years of his earthly ministry. And there's some big gaps and, what happened in between. But one of the things we do know is that Jesus sang. Jesus sang with the disciples. And we find that two places in the Gospels, both of which they're both in the Synoptics. And Matthew is where I'll point you. And I think it's Matthew chapter 24, if I remember correctly. But after the Last Supper, it says after they had sung the hymn, then they went out. It's just a little line, right? It's just a little line, but man, it's so important. If we're going to be like Christ, then we should sing together. And then, of course, we have Paul's letters in the New Testament, and of course, there's a very famous passage where he says, sing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. And so we have this admonition from Paul. And so there's lots of biblical examples of that. I could keep going all day. That's a whole seminary course on congregational song in the Bible. But I guess the last example would be, and I was just talking about this with the Tuesday Bible study here at my local church. The holy, holy, holy that we sing during communion, or that so many people sing during their communion liturgies, comes from Revelation, and which was really referencing what's the prophet Isaiah, and this heavenly vision, what are we going to be doing when we're in heaven? We're going to be singing. We're going to be singing praise to God, right? And so my mentor, C. Michael Hahn, would say that every Sunday when we're singing together, it's a rehearsal for our heavenly role, right? And so these are all biblical examples. And then we have the history of the church. I mean, the history of the church and what Christians have been doing for 2,000 years is important, right? It's what we've inherited. It's things that those faithful witnesses have felt were important and crucial to what it means to be a Christian. And we've always been a singing people. And even when the Roman Catholic Church's worship had moved away from congregational participation, the few centuries before the Reformation, when the people had largely been disenfranchised from participation in the Mass. Then what happened was the people found other ways to sing together. There was the strong home singing tradition. Excuse me. Home singing tradition where and that's where we get a lot of Marian excuse me Marian songs was from that home singing tradition. And we also had a lot of examples of the people would gather prior to the Mass and sing together. And so we've always been a singing people. Some resources that help with these conversations, of course, are definitely The Singing Thing. Oh, sorry, that's The Singing Thing too. The Singing Thing by John Bell. John's another one of my mentors and someone who inspired me to go into this line of work. And so The Singing Thing, the first volume by John Bell, is basically just talking about what we're talking about right now. This first question, why is congregational singing so important? And he just goes through lots of different examples, and it's a lovely read. It's got his wonderful wit and humor peppered throughout. And then, of course, The Singing Thing too is more of a practical guide of, okay, well, how do you get people singing? So I might reference this later in one of the other questions. The other place, if you want to do a deeper dive, because this is a little book, a much larger book is Sing with Understanding, third edition. This is the most recent edition of Sing with Understanding. It's edited by C. Michael Hahn, and is just full of wonderful theological reflections on hymns and hymnology. But the first 20 pages at least are, the introduction and the preface and all these things are essentially making this case. Why is singing so important? Congregational singing is so important. What is it about hymns and hymnology that deserves a book this size, right? And so there's lots of great stuff in there as well. Now, if you really want to geek out on this question, of course, there's a plethora of other resources that you could dig into. One of my favorite Roman Catholic scholars to read on this question is certainly Judith Kubicki, who makes some really strong theological cases and biblical cases for the importance of congregational song. I can throw these in the chat later, or even as I go, or if someone else knows what I'm talking about, you could throw it in the chat too. So we'll make sure they're in there. Paul Westermeyer is the definitely the foremost Lutheran scholar when it comes to this question. And Paul's resources are many, and is always a wonderful read. And then I would say Ruth Duck, who's if you're in the UCC world and you don't know Ruth Duck, then I have some good news for you. There was a woman named Ruth Duck who was just an amazing person and an amazing scholar, hymn writer, liturgical scholar, and both her hymns and her books on this topic are many and are rich and prophetic. And so check out Ruth Duck. Of course, there's many others, but those are the ones I thought I would lift up. Now, the second part of this question, what roles does congregational singing play in enriching a worship service? Um, First, I always love this idea that it connects us to the saints of the past, the present, and the future. I love making sure that my congregation knows that when we're singing together, um, on the one hand, it grounds us in the present, right? It's something that can only be done in the present, right? I can't take the last 10 minutes of this webinar and decide to sing. And I don't know what's going to happen 10 minutes from now, but right now, we could sing together. Like it grounds us in the present and it makes us all connected together here. But it also connects us, like I said, the history of the church, and even preceding the Christian church going all the way back um, to the Jewish witness of pre BCE, I guess. They're always a singing people. And so when we sing, we're kind of connected. And Judith Kubicki talks a lot about this. And there's this metaphysical aspect to singing together that really connects us to this great cloud of witnesses. And then into the future, right? Like when we're singing together, Christians in the future are going to do the same thing. And so there's this wonderful connection to past, present, and future. The second thing it does for us is that it embodies our worship, right? It's a very engaging act physically. Um, you can you can hear the music, you can hear the voices of other people, of the instruments, or whatever the case may be. So that there's this very stimulating, oral thing happening. You can feel the vibration of your vocal cords. You can feel the rumble of the bass of the organ. You can feel maybe even sometimes if you're singing holding hands, you can feel other people, right? And so it's this very kind of physical act as far as the sense of touch. And visually, it can also be very stimulating and engaging, right? You can see the instrumentalists playing. You can see the choir leading the way. You can see the people around you doing the same thing as you. And so um, all of these things are happening when we're singing together. And so it's a very engaging act for our bodies. The next thing is it connects us to our breath. And this is important for a few reasons. So, first of all, um, for any of you that have done any therapy, which at this point in the 21st century, I hope we've destigmatized therapy to the point where most of us have had some therapy because life is hard. Um, but you'll have probably come across breathing, right? We're taught breathing exercises to help regulate our bodies, to help regulate our emotions. Breathing and being intentional about our breath is a very powerful thing. And so when we're singing together, it's essentially helping to regulate our breath, for the whole congregation. We're all kind of regulating ourselves together. And so that's important in and of itself, right? And that grounds us, it centers us. But also it unifies us. When a group of people breathe together, then we begin to unify as a group, like quite physically. In fact, they've done studies where when people sing together, then the heartbeats begin to converge to a similar BPM, beats per minute, right? So if I'm at 60 and you're at 80 and we start singing together, then, if the tempo is somewhere around 70, we will start converging towards 70. And if we sing long enough, we'll arrive to this place of unity, actually physically in our heartbeats, which is an amazing thing, right? And so there's all these reasons why that's another role that singing plays in our worship. It actually physically grounds us and unifies us. And the last thing I'll say as a part of this question of the roles that congregational singing plays to enrich worship is that it carries theological words and ideas. Now, if you've studied Luther, Luther said that music is the handmaiden of theology, And I was just teaching a Lutheran catechism class, and I actually disagree with Luther on this one. While I agree that music does carry the words that Luther was talking about, that is theology, how what we talk about and what we think about God. I actually think it's more important than that. At a very basic level, making music is theology. It doesn't just carry theology, it actually is theology. And the reason I say that is that when we make music, whether it's with an ensemble or whether it's with a full congregation singing together, um, what's happening at a very fundamental level is it is connecting us to who God made us to be. When God made the heavens and the earth, and we get to that point in the Genesis story where God made people, it says that we were made in the likeness of God, right? We were made in the likeness of God. And in the context of that story, God is creator. And so to be made in the likeness of God means that we are a creative being. So when we're making music together, when we're singing together as a congregation, we're actually kind of rewinding ourselves out of our sinfulness and out of whatever we think we should be, back to this very core identity of the creative beings that God made us to be in God's likeness, right? So even if we're just humming together, even if no words are involved, by making music together, we are doing a theological act by saying, God, you are creator God, we are creative beings, and we are made in your likeness, and we're celebrating that, right? We're living into that. So I think that Luther, while he had good intentions and he had a lot of great theological thoughts, he missed the mark on music by saying it's the handmaiden of theology, and rather music is theology. So that's all I'll say about that, about those two questions, unless you want me to expound on anything else before we get to question number two.
No, we have a whole bunch of questions to get through, so I'm in great gratitude for the richness of that answer. I might encourage slightly less rich answers just to make sure we have a little time for conversation moving forward,
Noted.
because we only will go until the top of the hour. And before I ask the next question, I will just remind us that something you didn't mention, but I think is sort of implied in a lot of what you said, is that music also plays a very important role in our emotional experiences in worship. And that could be a whole other conversation. But
Certainly,
moving on,
certainly.
because we've invited you here to help us improve congregational singing, the second question is, where in your experience are the weak points in congregational singing?
Yeah, so I have 3 points that I'll make, and I'll make them briefly. We don't want to dwell on a negative, but we definitely want to point them out, so because they're definitely growing edges. First is our cultural surroundings. I think a weak point in our congregational singing is simply the culture in which we find ourselves in 21st century America. Um, Singing together has very quickly gone out of fashion, and outside of the church. And so within the church, I think our singing is suffering because it's a countercultural act. People arrive in our worship spaces not having any kind of expectation, culturally speaking, or any practice singing together. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is that I think that we have a lot of growing to do when it comes to connecting music educational best practices with congregational song leadership. Um, John Bell talks a good bit about this, that a choir and a congregation are very different things. And they need to be treated differently. And my experience has been that most people are trying to approach congregational song leadership through the techniques and lens of a choral director. So I think there's room to improve there. And then finally, I think that one of our weakest points, especially as Protestants, my experience has been that Protestants often suffer from this, is that we don't understand, or we don't pay enough attention, or we don't give it enough thought or planning of the flow of worship. And so the songs often feel like a separate little piece of the puzzle. and there isn't those connectional things that weave it together so that worship has a real sense of flow. Lester Ruth wrote a book on this, kind of lifting up the contemporary praise and worship movement as a worship movement that really does understand flow a lot better, and kind of talks about some of the things we can learn from that movement as Protestants that haven't necessarily adopted that style of worship. So flow is the third thing, and then I'll stop.
Okay, I don't want to censor your thoughts. I just want to make sure we kind of balance what we do with our time.
Mm-hmm.
So you may well have plenty more time to expound on some of these things a little bit later.
Yep.
So how can those weaker areas be improved?
Yes. Yeah. Um, well, first of all, I think acknowledging that we live in a culture that does not value or incorporate congregational singing or group singing in many places, I think that we need to be very intentional about building a culture of congregational singing within our congregations. And this is, like I said, countercultural work. And because it's countercultural, it means that it will take intentionality and some gumption and some long-term planning. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. All right. So there's not to beat a dead horse here, but in the singing thing too, that is what this book mainly deals with, is how do you build a culture of congregational singing. Some tips and tricks for that. Um, you know, speak highly of congregational singing and of your congregation singing as much as possible. Right, point out its importance, not just in worship, but in all places. Right, Bible studies and mission teams, or wherever else you might encounter the congregation on a weekly basis. Spread the good news about how important it is and how your congregation is really becoming a singing congregation, or whatever language you want to use that puts a positive spin on it. John Bell talks about how churches are really great at spreading rumors, something that we could certainly work on when it's something negative. But if you can spread a positive rumor, then you can mechanize that tendency that we have to spread rumors to spread something positive, right? That wow, did you hear "It Is Well with My Soul" last Sunday? That is the best "It Is Well with My Soul" I've ever heard a congregation sing. Right? Wow, we're good at that. Right? What a great rumor to spread. So that's the first thing. So the second thing is that choirs and congregations are different, and so we should treat them so. Right? I have an article on the four functions of a church choir, and you can just Google that. I don't remember when I wrote it. It was many years ago, but I think it still holds water. I see the choir as one of the most important tools to support congregational singing that we have. So if you do have a choir, even if it's very small, they can be the leaders of congregational song, right? And so when people begin to see the choir as a subset of the congregation that are leading them in song, it creates a very different atmosphere than whenever the choir is singing, we're listening, right? There may be those moments where the choir sings and we listen. But if you begin to change that relationship, then it can go a long way. The second thing is that a four pattern in choral conducting means very, very little to the majority of people sitting in the pews, right? If it's in three, that doesn't mean much to many people in the pews. There are gestures that are more effective for a congregation that you may not use with a choir, and vice versa. Right? There is, of course, some overlap, such as like a nice big breathing cue to a downbeat. Right? If there's like a big introduction and the congregation doesn't know when to enter, joyful, that is kind of universal, right? Joyful, joyful, right? But then don't keep conducting, because that doesn't necessarily help, unless you're maybe conducting an ensemble or something. Um, line, most people know that this means your voice goes down and this means your voice goes up. right? I wouldn't necessarily use that with a choir very often. Maybe if I'm teaching them by rote, or maybe if I have a group that doesn't read music. But for my choir, I never really show them these things unless we're practicing a congregational song. I wouldn't teach an anthem that way. But for a congregation, this can be very helpful for people where you're showing them, okay, we're going up here and we're going down here, right? So you can practice that, and it's a very helpful gesture. So that's a couple of examples of how a choir and congregation might be treated differently from each other. And finally, talking about the how to deal with flow, I would say we need to think more liturgically and we need to think more dramatically. And so I'll break that up. Liturgically, um, when we're thinking liturgically, the tendency in a lot of our worship planning and a lot of the tools we use even reinforce this idea is that we have this and then this and then this and then this. And if we do all those little pieces, then we've done worship, right? But I think when we really look at a liturgy that's done well, and when we experience a liturgy that's done well, instead of this, and this, we experience this, right? Or maybe, little like a little bouncing ball arc where it has ebbs and flows within the larger ebb and flow. And I think we need to think more that way. So the body of the liturgy may be made up of individual elements, but what connects those elements is equally important, right? I like to think of it as, or one example would be the way a body works, right? Some of the most important parts of our body are our bones and our muscles, right? Because our bones give it structure and our muscles make our bodies move. But if the connective tissue that connects our muscles and our bones aren't there, we can't move, right? Or if those things are inflamed or they're not working right, then our movements become clunky or painful, right? And that's what happens in a liturgy when we don't think about the connective tissue, is it kind of becomes painful. It's like, oh, now we have to stand there and watch this person walk up for 30 seconds because they didn't realize that they were next and there's nothing else to do. So these unintentional moments or hiccups can really kind of hinder a liturgy from having that flow. So thinking about what's happening in between the prayer and the hymn, right? How are you going to connect the prayer and the hymn together so that it has a natural connection? What's happening after the hymn leading into or maybe one of my pet peeves is the Alleluia into the reading of the gospel. The reader of the gospel should move to wherever they're going to be reading during the Alleluia, because if the Alleluia stops and then the person leaves the pew and goes up to the podium, we're just watching someone walk, which is one of the most uninspiring things you could do. It's a waste of everyone's time. I'm a big fan of silence in worship, but it should be intentional silence that's framed for some sort of purpose, not we're waiting on Martha to get up to the podium, right? So thinking through those little moments can make such a big difference in creating the flow. So thinking liturgically, that's the first thing I mean. The second thing is dramatically. So one thing we should avoid is being cheesy, right? It has its place and some people can get away with cheese, but overall, we don't want our liturgies to feel cheesy, right? But I think an equally something to be avoided as much as being cheesy is being boring, right? God is a lot of things, but boring's not one of them, right? The biblical witness has some crazy stuff in it. And the resurrection of Jesus Christ is an astounding assertion that is one of the most dramatic things we could possibly imagine as human beings. All this coming back from the dead and conquering evil and conquering death and saving the entire world. Like, this is dramatic stuff, and it's amazing stuff, right? So if our liturgies, which are trying to retell this story and celebrate this story to the God that we love is boring. That's bad, right? I think it's bad theologically. I think it's bad evangelistically, and it's certainly bad liturgically. So we should avoid that, right? How can our liturgies, how can our music making, how can our congregational singing be interesting, can it be exciting, even when it's quiet, right? Silences can be amazingly engaging, or they can be terribly boring. And a lot of that has to do with how we set it up and how intentional we are to make sure that it's at the right place at the right time for the right length, right? So paying attention to, okay, what's this hymn like? Where do the people need to go? Think dramatically. We're telling a dramatic story, so we should think that way too. So I'll stop there so we can get to the next question.
Wonderful. One thing I would actually throw in on the challenge of being countercultural is the need for us to invite people to sing even if they think they don't sing well. And so something I often say when I'm teaching a new piece of music, something they don't know, is that I will, sing or line out the melody, but also that people should not be uncomfortable if they are singing a note other than the melody, because that's called the harmony. And it always gets a laugh, but it also, I think, relaxes people a little bit. So anything we can do to dissuade them from sort of professional expectations about what singing has to sound like, I think is in keeping with the spirit of the kind of thing we're doing. Okay. So the UCC Musicians Association is beginning to think more seriously about the situation of what we call star churches or small town and rural churches. And we are working toward having an initiative to really support some of those communities. And with that context in mind, what advice do you have for pastors and music directors at small congregations where there may be only a tiny choir or even no choir, and where there may be few or no people who are really able to lead congregational singing? What are kind of the best practices or hopes for those communities?
Yeah, sure. This is certainly something that's a big issue for our time because the gap between large churches and small churches is ever growing, especially in Protestant realms. There are less and less mid-sized churches in the United States. And so the first thing I'll say is to focus on songs that people find meaning in. If people find a song meaningful, they're more likely to sing it with more passion. And if they know that other people within the congregation find meaning in it, they're more likely to sing it out of respect or support of their friends and siblings in Christ. So find out like what stories are behind the songs that your people love, right? And this is avoiding the word like very intentionally, right? It's not that I like this song. It's fine to like songs. We all have preferences, right? But I love the word, if asking someone which hymn or song means a lot to you is a different question than which song do you like, right? And what you'll get is you'll get stories of weddings, you'll get stories of funerals, you'll get stories of grandparents, you'll get stories of those moments in people's lives that actually mean a lot to them and have some core memories. And then, having those people share those stories, one of the things that I love about small churches is that there does tend to be a more familial atmosphere in a lot of places, and there's flexibility there, right? If you have a congregation of 1,000, you can't say like everyone's going to get up and they're going to tell their favorite story about their favorite hymn over the next year, because that would actually take like 20 years, right? But with a small congregation of 20 or 30 people, you can say like, hey, over the next year, I want each of you to choose one hymn for us to sing together. And I want you to be able to tell a story about it. Why does it mean a lot to you? And it doesn't have to be complicated, but I just want you to share, if you're willing, to share about why it's meaningful to you. And just by doing that, just by having someone say, you know what, this is the song that I sang at my mother's funeral, And it really helped me through, one of the hardest parts of my life. Then you better believe that everyone's going to try their darndest to sing that hymn well, right? Because they're like, oh man, like Sue, this song means the world to Sue, and so I'm going to do my best to sing it well for Sue, right? Um, so that's the first thing. Um, so make those connections. And the other thing that helps with that, it gets us away from this idea that we're supposed to perform it well or that it has to be musically good, but rather that singing is actually about like expressing ourselves to God and to each other, right? Which is at a deeper level than just like, if you can sing good, we need to make sure it sounds good because that's what God wants. God wants our music to sound good, right? Like, no, that's not what this is about. God wants us to express ourselves and our deepest, connections and emotions and desires. So it gets us out of that rut too, of this idea that if I can't sing well, I shouldn't do it because it'll offend people. No, we're all doing this. The second thing is check out, there are two resources I'll point you towards. Hymnary.org, which I can throw in the chat. Even if you know what hymnary.org is, you may not know that there are accompaniment recordings for thousands of hymns on there. In fact, if you want, I'll just do a quick detour. I wonder if I could share my screen. No, I can't. I can't share my screen. But if you allow me to, whoever has the power to do that, I can show you on hymnary.org how that works.
Ed, you can make that happen, right?
I think I can send a request if you want. Let's see. There you go. Request has been sent. Cool. All right, here we go. All right, screen two. All right, so here's hymnary.org, and let's just go to Come Thou Fount. So we're going to Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing, and then if you look at audio files, that's a piano. But a lot of times, if you scroll down to the tune page, if you actually go to the tune, there may be even more audio files. Sometimes there's a MIDI and there's a recording, but sometimes this one, interestingly, this one doesn't have as many as I had hoped for. Oh, audio. There we go. I knew it was around here somewhere. You go down to the media thing and you go to audio and look at how many recordings are available. So this one is organ. I didn't share my sound, so you may not be hearing that well. Let's see. Let me see if I can do it again so you can hear. Do 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 do. There we go. Now you should be able to hear it. That one's organ, piano, bigger organ. And there's all these different versions. These are from small church music, lots of great recordings, and some from various hymnal things. So there's an abundance of resources there. If you don't have an accompanist, but you can't sing a cappella very well or for very many pieces, that could be a good option for you. The other thing I'll point you towards is Music That Makes Community is a wonderful organization. I know Amanda's very familiar with Music That Makes Community. And they have a lot of teaching videos of very simple songs that can be very meaningful and taught very easily by rote and a cappella. They also have resources on helping people learn how to lead a cappella. And it doesn't have to be someone who's a musician. It can just be a normal person. In fact, John Bell even says in many ways, having someone lead congregational singing who doesn't have a really good trained voice can be empowering, so that everyone realizes like, oh, I can sing as good as that guy. I'm going to sing too. It has this way of saying like, no, this is for everyone, right? It's not just for the trained opera singers. And then finally, create a playlist for your congregation, right? Choose maybe 10 hymns or songs over the next season, right? Maybe the summer season or for Advent or whatever it is. and create a playlist on YouTube or Spotify or whatever, and then give it to your congregation and say, hey, everyone listen to this playlist 3 times before next Sunday. So that by the time you get to Sunday, everyone has a really kind of firm grasp on the songs that you want to sing and they've kind of sung along with them or whatever. That's another good teaching tool that we have in the 21st century that we need to use more. And I'll stop there so we can get the last question because I know we want to have conversation too.
So what I actually think we're going to do is skip the last two questions because they've either already been covered somewhat or they may come up in the conversation. And so what I'd love to do is give us a few minutes to first ask Brian questions. So let's make sure that any questions are sort of where we begin. But then this is also a time when anyone among us can share resources that we find helpful. So there are a couple of hymn writers and songwriters in the room, and we may come back to some of the resources that those of us who do that provide. But let's start with any questions for Brian about this topic. So unmute and speak aloud.
And I threw the resources in the chat that I was going to lift up anyways. So that's all in the chat now.
That's wonderful. Thanks. Okay. Who's got a question or thought for Brian?
Well, I've been having much success with finding Carolyn Winfrey Gillette's lyrics. She is very talented, and she has taken melodies, hymn tunes that many of us grew up with. Now, maybe younger congregations, if they haven't been exposed to what I call traditional, or I'm starting to age myself, right? But she takes hymn tunes that many of us are going to be familiar with, and the lyrics that she is writing are very inclusive, very meaningful. I am a music director at a very small church here in Eau Claire, only about 80 members, and most of them senior citizens, and they are loving using her resources. So just throwing that out there. I'm sure you're aware of her work.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, Carolyn writes almost a hymn a week, I think, at this point.
Yeah.
And has a huge repertoire of texts that are almost all set to common tunes. So that can be very helpful.
And if I can throw in one more thought on her work, very pertinent to what's happening in our world right now. Yes, so very meaningful. People, and this is again an older congregation, and when I have used her works or her lyrics in the last few months, I've had many members come up and say thank you and loved that and loved what we were singing today. So
That's great.
there again, yeah.
And since you brought her up, I've thrown my website into the chat as well. I write a lot of completely free use, progressive, inclusive sacred music, new stuff, but also, like Carolyn, I write new text to traditional tunes. So that's in there, all free. Have at it if you like.
Yeah.
So yeah, okay. Other questions or thoughts for Brian, or would anyone else like to plug their work? Because we have at least one other person here who is certainly welcome to do so if they like.
Brian, good to see you. My question
Hey.
has to do with cross-cultural singing and strengthening that. Many small congregations, small Euro-American congregations in particular, don't feel like they have the expertise, don't feel like they have the resources to engage in the music of other cultures. They're nervous about questions of cultural appropriation. And so oftentimes they just don't. And I wonder if you have any suggestions for congregations of any size, but especially congregations that feel like they don't have it within them to be able to take on that challenge.
Yeah. Yeah, it's great question. Definitely something a lot of people are grappling with. I'll just very briefly on cultural appropriation. Um, we find ourselves in a very interesting place in the 21st century United States and Canada, of especially folks who are in progressive congregations, kind of grappling with what does it mean to decolonize our worship and our singing and all these things. And so there's some wonderful resources on that. The first thing is simply to educate ourselves. If you're a pastoral leader or a musical leader, or even just a leader within the congregation who helps with worship, there's some great things to read. The Calvin Institute of Christian Worship has things out there. There's a book called Flipping the Songbird by Becca Whitla, who's a Anglican Canadian, although she's done a lot of work with the United Church of Canada. All these things are important to read. And then the second thing I'll say about this is that you should try it. Don't be scared. Because even the cultures that do their own music really well have a multitude of churches that do their own music very poorly too. What's more important is that you give it the respect that you give all your other musics, right? So if you're doing a Mighty Fortress and you spend 2 hours practicing it to make sure that you have every note perfect, then if you're doing, an Alleluia from Myanmar, you should spend a lot of time practicing it and making sure that you have it to the best of your own ability, right? So give it the respect it deserves first. That goes a long way. And the second thing I guess I'll say about cross-cultural worship is that the more you can connect it to your own congregation's stories and personal values and experiences, the better. And at this point, you'd be hard-pressed to find a congregation that doesn't have some sort of connection to somewhere around the globe for some reason. Right. My local congregation, I came in, they've been doing a mission in the Dominican Republic with a Pentecostal congregation for 15 years. And so I said, have you ever sung something from the Dominican Republic? And they're like, no. And I was like, well, let's do that. Right. So that the next time you go down there, you can sing their song with them and you can tell them we're singing your song. Right. Because we love our relationship. And they were like, yeah, that makes total sense. Right. They just never thought about it. One of our congregation members, we don't have a mission in Myanmar, but one of our congregation members hosted a missionary from Myanmar for a couple of years while they were doing some work here in the States. And they shared that story and we sang an Alleluia from Myanmar. Right. And so there was it wasn't just like, we're going to do this because we feel like we should, but rather we want to do this because we have a story about why it's important to us. And we want to build that relationship. And I think that's what's at the core of avoiding cultural appropriation, but still doing cross-cultural music in various ways, is trying to strengthen relationship. And I think this is also where I get a little annoyed with World Communion Sunday and Black History Month, and where people fall into some traps there, right? If you only sing songs from around the world on World Communion Sunday and you don't do it any other time for any other reason, then you're essentially kind of tokenizing that for that one purpose. Same with Black History Month. If you only sing songs from Black composers or, Negro spirituals in February because it's like, well, it's Black History Month, that's what we're supposed to do, you're not really actually deepening your relationship and being intentional about making it a part of who you are. And so that kind of becomes tokenism and then appropriation. If you use those as a starting point, you're like, you know what, we've never intentionally done music by the Black community in our church. This February, we're going to start doing that. If that's the starting point, and then you say, okay, And then in March, we're going to sing that song again. And then in April, we're going to sing that song again, so that by the summertime, we know that song, right? And we can do it well. And maybe you bring in someone to talk about it. Any congregation can do that of any size, right? It's about intentionality and building relationships out of a sense of respect and celebration that God is bigger than we are. And I think so that's like that at the core is like, how do we use this to build relationship and do the work that God's calling us to do, not out of some sense of obligation or guilt.
And where do you send church musicians, especially from small congregations, to learn how to lead music from another culture in a way that at least tries to honor the musical style of that culture? Like, where do you send them to learn that?
That's a hard question. That's a difficult question because there's not a lot of great resources on that out there. There are conferences that lean into that and try to do it well, but that can be difficult for people from small churches because they're part-time or completely volunteer and they have full-time positions in the real world, doing other stuff. And so that can be really difficult. I will say there is a growing amount of resources. Once again, to shout out the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship, they have some wonderful presentations from folks around the world. The last World Council of Churches meeting in the Global Assembly, they only do it about every 8 years, was in Karlsruhe, Germany in 2022, I think. I took every song from their prayer services for like a 2-week span or a 10-day span, and put them on our YouTube channel for the Hymn Society. So there's just like this playlist of like 50 songs from around the world done in a way that passed muster for the World Council of Churches. And so, that's a reliable source as well, and a great source of some really cool literature. But then you can actually see people leading it and hear how it can be done. Not that it's the only way it can be done, but it's like a solid resource. So, leaning into online resources like that can be
Can you put a
helpful.
link to that playlist in the chat?
Yes, I can.
And while he's doing that, I'll mention one other initiative that the UCC Musicians Association is proud of is our Royalties for Spirituals program. So we invite churches that are using Negro spirituals or certain African American traditional music to set aside a little money and donate it to a couple of organizations as a form of reparation. If folks ever go to my website, I also discuss this on my subpage on African American music and have links to some of those organizations. So there's a way of giving back even as we engage with these materials. So we are almost at time. Is there any one last question or thought for Brian before we head out for the day? And while you're thinking, Ed, I'm kind of assuming that the resources in the chat can be saved and put in the show notes for this for when it goes to YouTube. Is that true?
You won't be able to see the chat in the YouTube, but when we send out an email telling you that it is now posted on our YouTube site, in the text of that email will be all the links.
Great. Wonderful. Okay. Last thoughts or comments? Okay, well, with that, we are about at time. Brian, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, for sharing your wisdom and deep experience and the many resources that I see in the chat. Those are going to be so wonderful for the musicians in our communities and the ones that interact with us.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate the invitation, and thank you all for being here, and keep leading song and going to things like this. And it's a lifelong journey that it's just super fun and I think glorifies God. So thank you.
And with that last reminder, a reminder that again, our conference is coming up in Columbus from July 8th to 11th, and early bird registration has been extended with the discount until the end of tomorrow. So if you were thinking about going but haven't registered yet, please do that today or tomorrow and get your discount. Hope to see some of you in Columbus. And have a joyous summer, everyone. Take good care.